Our moderator for the session is Wendy Walker, Director of the ADB Sectors Group Human and Social Development Sector Office. She heads the amazing social development practice team here at ADB that has put this whole APSP week together. Wendy provides technical leadership in social development and social protection and facilitates collaboration across sectors and technical groups in ADB and with external partners. She co-leads the implementation of ADB Strategy 2030's first operational priority on addressing remaining poverty and reducing inequalities. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Wendy Walker.
So thank you very much. Good to see the room still really pretty full. So congratulations on coming into the third day with this level of energy. And thank you very much, Shahra, for that excellent keynote this morning and providing us really that macro view and then zooming into some of the most important issues in terms of financing and also in terms of the kinds of initiatives which are underway to help to accelerate action moving forward. So thank you very much. This session has that title of Navigating Change, Innovation Shaping the Future of Social Protection. And what we were thinking about here is, the content and future directions of social protection in the region will continue to be shaped by a range of factors embedded in the global and regional contexts, including demographic transitions, evolving forms of work, rapid digital transformation, and climate change. So many of the issues that we've talked about all week. But in this session, we wanted to try to shift our view. We started the plenary, we started the conference on Tuesday with the first plenary with Secretaries Gachilan, Hermans, and Khan, and heard about the experience of their countries during COVID and priorities for their social protection systems going forward. And now we wanted to shift to a panel of practitioners and ask you, when you look out to the horizon and see and imagine what comes next, what do you hear as drumbeats of change, however faint or loud? So this is really looking at examples for the future, things that might be emerging. So what new ideas, institutional models, creative approaches to social protection delivery and financing and connections to broader ecosystems, or connecting the dots, as Maribel said yesterday, do you see that can complement and enhance social protection systems, enabling them to better address the ever-increasing challenges that drive insecurity and vulnerability? So we're going to start this session with a very quick outline from Michael on future directions for social protection in Asia and Pacific, and identify how these will help drive policy responses in the region. And then the discussion with the panelists will highlight new approaches, sources of financing, and forms of partnership, and assess the opportunities they offer to deliver more inclusive, responsive, and sustainable social protection systems. So thank you, and over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Wendy. I think it's working now. I will draw on 5 ideas that I worked on, and I'm not sure this is working. Looks like it should be. Oh, there we go. Not so well. Okay. Thank you, Wendy. I had the privilege of working with the ADB last year on research looking at future directions in social protection in the region. And I just want to recap 5 of the ideas that are still relevant from that research. First, as we heard so well from Shahra just a few minutes ago, social protection systems will become more inclusive and begin to move towards more universal approaches. Second, as we talked about yesterday, the link between social and economic infrastructure and the integration with social protection will become more important. And the third direction, taking that further in a strategic direction, as we see in the ADB's new directional guide for social protection, it becomes really the social dimension of this just transition to green and sustainable development. And fourth, as we've seen in so many sessions, there's a increasing focus on digitization, and finally, the growing demand for evidence in governments across the region. And even though these ideas were articulated more than a year ago, when we look at the program for this week, we see the themes covered in these sessions resonating very much with this first theme of growing inclusion. In fact, I've missed many of the sessions in drawing these circles, including the excellent keynote we just heard. But what we've seen over the past few years is the impact of a universal shock and how important universal responses are, particularly for the most vulnerable groups. And so we've seen the responses, and in fact, if you go out into the hallway and go down to the booths where people are presenting their evidence and their work, you see a lot of work focusing on disability, inclusive social protection, child-sensitive social protection for older people. The role of social protection in tackling vulnerability is more important than ever. And as we look at the role of COVID in driving that, we saw in response to crisis the biggest increase in social protection coverage in the history of humanity. But as Shahra just said, our work is not yet done. There are still massive gaps. And the big, and I think the first and foremost direction, is the growing recognition by policymakers across the region of the power of social protection to build resilience, and how this need will be accelerated due to climate change. And in particular, this is not just a response to shocks. This is a core developmental capacity building that builds the resilience to shrug off those disasters when they happen, rather than allow them to become catastrophes. The second trend, and again, we've seen it yesterday in the plenary and covered today, and permeating many of our discussions, is the integration of social and economic infrastructure. We heard about it from the panel from the Philippines country director, the Davao Public Transit Modernization Project. It's not just about social safeguards. It's about an intricate integration of social protection into the design of infrastructure projects, so that these infrastructure projects are not just incorporating social protection instruments, they're delivering social protection objectives of equity and inclusion and development in their core design. You know, this phone is a piece of hardware, just like infrastructure is the hardware of green and sustainable economic growth. But this piece of hardware, without the operating system, without the software, is just an expensive paperweight. In the same way, social protection supports, it's the software supporting and integrating with the hardware of social and economic infrastructure, driving inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. And policymakers across the region and around the world are recognizing this. And it's the point you just made about the role of social protection in driving economic dynamism. And this goes further, as we saw in the excellent panel discussion by Kate Hughes and the team on that panel on the just transition on Tuesday, and in many of the other sessions. Social protection is becoming the social dimension of this integrated set of strategies. Climate change is disruptive. Climate change mitigation is also disruptive. And COVID-19 has taught us how much social protection responses are necessary to not only make the policy responses equitable, but to make them effective and sustainable as well. And COVID is at least a dress rehearsal for the kinds of responses climate change will require. And social protection goes beyond shock responsiveness, beyond adaptation, beyond enabling development partners and governments to help workers adversely affected by these shocks. Social protection becomes the enabler, the developmental synergizer, the glue that binds together the planks of an integrated climate development and equity strategy. The fourth trend, and we've seen this in many of the sessions today, in the next session we'll see, and tomorrow on digitization, on inclusive financial inclusion and its technologies, it's the increasing role we see for digital technologies. Asia and the Pacific is the leading region globally, and many of the countries represented here have advanced in integrating digital technologies into the delivery of social protection systems. But it goes beyond the social protection systems. Just as cash transfers were the first viral app for social protection, the first wave of social protection in the 1990s and 2000s, making markets and governments work better for the poor and the vulnerable. COVID has taught us that there's another kind of transfer that may be even more important, and these are welfare improving information transfers, digital inclusion. And we've seen it, again, if you walk down to the marketplace, you'll see the Open MIS strategy, a booth on interoperability of social protection systems. These demonstrate the global public good of technology in supporting social protection systems. But digital inclusion goes much further. How did we cope during COVID? Technology enabled emergency remote learning for our children. We used e-markets to access the goods and services we needed to survive. Telehealth enabled us to access vital health services when it was too risky to go to a clinic or hospital. How many of us worked from home? And we've also seen governments using this technology to digitalize apps for access to social protection and for delivering social protection benefits. Welfare improving information transfers are more important than ever. But it comes with risks that cash did not come with. Information can be distorted and abused. Unscrupulous financial operators can use these technologies to adversely include the most vulnerable. It also creates new demands for consumer protections and financial and technology literacy to ensure these technologies are constructive and productive. And it highlights the importance of tackling the digital divide so that these technologies do not exacerbate inequality. And the final trend I want to highlight is the growing demand for evidence. There's a session right after this about monitoring and evaluation, and tomorrow on knowledge systems. But really, it's been this whole week that has been about evidence and its importance. And this is perhaps the time to congratulate the ADB and the team of partners on such an excellent week, such an incredible event, but also to warn Wendy that the most common response I've heard has been, wow, this has been great. I can't wait till next year. But it reflects what we see with governments all across the region, an incredible demand, and I didn't see this 3 or 4 years ago, for evidence informing social protection policy and design. Part of it might be because resources are so constrained, but also, as you pointed out, there's a growing recognition of the role this plays in economic dynamism. Andrea Rossi just, I think 2 days ago in that excellent panel on public finance, put up an amazing slide showing the huge role of the public sector budgets in delivering social delivery in this region, and the tiny dot that is development partner support. We don't see this in Africa. You know, the development partner contribution to social protection often dwarfs government contributions in many African countries. But when development partner support is such a small component of the overall response, perhaps the greatest return on investment is from catalyzing better public action. And if the demand is there, and this is, in this region, compared to other regions, the development partner support to knowledge building and capacity development is relatively small. This is one of the few events, maybe the only regular event, that brings together the entire region to share knowledge. And I can't imagine any kind of investment that has a greater return. We see the demand for things like the ADB's social protection indicator, this kind of event, but also growing demand, and we're working with a number of countries on communities of practice. The good thing about communities of practice is they take a lot of the burden off your shoulder. They're hosted by country governments, sharing country governments' experiences, and they are often more attuned to the specific themes relevant to a group of governments working in social protection. But this key direction is very promising, and we're hearing it in many governments. They want this evidence, they want this knowledge, and they want it to inform better and more productive social protection systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that very good overview of future priorities. Michael has a chapter in both of the volumes of the Social Protection Indicator that we published at the end of last year, which looks at the set of priorities for the Pacific region, which are a little bit different than the ones for the Asia region also, and some of the distinctions there. They also provide, I think, a very good overview of the past 20 years' history of the development of systems in the region, which I think is good reading for everybody. So thank you, Michael. Now I want to switch to the panelists, and we will move at a little bit of a fast pace. But let me first introduce Laura Alfers, who's the director of the Social Protection Program at the Women in Informal Employment Globalizing and Organizing, which we probably all know as WIEGO. And also she's a research associate at the Department of Sociology at Rhodes University in South Africa. Over the last 10 years, she has worked on various aspects of social policy to better include women working in the informal economy, including healthcare, childcare, and social protection systems. So Laura, welcome to ADB. And we've heard a lot in the earlier sessions about the critical need to extend financing in social protection. And WIEGO has this long history in advocating for and supporting those in the informal sector. In Asia and Pacific, they represent a huge proportion of the working population, and they also represent one of the largest gaps in social protection coverage in the region. So can you tell us some of the examples which Shahra was referring to, or alluding to, that you've been identifying where workers' organizations have been successful or may be successful in the future in mobilizing additional financing for social protection through relationships with governments or different market actors, even if they aren't employers?
Thanks very much, Wendy. Can you hear me? this one's working. Thanks very much. Wendy, yes, thank you. And yeah, as a follow-up to Shahra's excellent keynote, just understanding the importance of social contributions and contributory models in the landscape for social protection going forward. Even though we work with workers in the informal economy who are often outside of employment relationships, it is often the reforms that are going on in contributory schemes that the organizations of informal workers with whom WIEGO works, they're often drawn into that part of the social protection discussion. And it's partly why we were so interested in working with the ILO on understanding the future of social contributions, because instinctively we knew that while there was maybe a global narrative about the death of social insurance, at national level, that is where the worker organizations we work with are often being integrated into social protection. So I think looking at the extension of contributory schemes, there's always the question of who contributes. Where do these social contributions come from? Obviously, there are the workers themselves, and yes, not all informal workers are poor. They do have some contributory capacity. We heard yesterday on the plenary panel about the importance of state subsidies that have really driven the expansion of social insurance schemes or contributory schemes where they have gained large coverage. And I think that's really important too, because although not all informal workers are poor, if you look at the data for Asia Pacific, 34% of women's informal employment is in contributing family work. That's a very vulnerable form of informal work. And those kind of workers are going to need state support integrated into the contributory systems. And then to pick up on Shahra's point, where there is an employer identifiable, we do need to be ensuring that employers contribute as well. So particularly thinking about informal workers, waged workers such as domestic workers. The tricky issue always does come in when we're talking about the self-employed, and although there are obviously definitional issues about who is really self-employed, this is one of the areas where WIEGO has been very concerned. Again, looking to the data, Asia Pacific, I think 46% of workers overall are in own account, self-employment, so they work for themselves, not employing other people. And that rises to 62% in South Asia, so a not insignificant part of the workforce in this region. Where do the contributions come from? There are contributions from the workers themselves, but if we're talking about the adequacy of benefits and making sure that the benefits are adequate, quite often informal workers are not able to put aside enough to actually sustain meaningful benefits towards the end of their working lives. And so part of the sort of curiosity for us is, can we think about other counterparts, other contributory counterparts for the self-employed? And can we look beyond the state to do that? And so to answer this question at WIEGO, because we are driven by worker organizations, by membership-based organizations of workers on the ground, we go to them first to see where we can find the inspiration and to see if we can see trends on the ground. And one of the trends we've been picking up, which has been quite interesting, actually derives from a very old form of financing that started in India in the 1950s called workers' welfare boards, which looked beyond the employment relationship to leverage financing for welfare for workers in various sectors. So headload porters, there's an extra tax. If you can hire a headload porter in a market, you pay a little bit extra. That goes into a workers' welfare board, which finances protections. There's the perhaps better-known construction workers' welfare board in India, which takes a 1% tax on construction industry, goes into a fund that pays welfare benefits to construction workers. What's been interesting, there are many problems with these schemes, but as somebody said in our recent podcast, it's a powerful idea. And what we're starting to see is worker organizations picking up on these ideas. Two of them in India. Recently in Rajasthan, a gig workers welfare board has gone through the assembly, the state assembly. It's still to be signed into law, but it will levy a 1% to 2% tax on platforms, which will go into a welfare fund, financing social protection benefits for gig workers. Waste pickers in the city of Pune have managed to argue successfully that their welfare needs, pension and health in particular, should be integrated into municipal budgets, that they provide a service, a waste management service, recycling, and that was successfully argued for the last 10 years. They've had health and pension benefits contributed to by the municipality. And then a very interesting example, taking inspiration from India, but actually moving over to Latin America and to Argentina, where one of the organizations of waste pickers is leveraging new environmental legislation around packaging laws, which says that manufacturers have the responsibility for the end life of their plastic products, the plastic packaging that they produce, and that, and because waste pickers are the people who take care of the packaging at the end of its life, that creates a relationship between the corporations and what waste pickers are doing. They have developed a draft law which has some approval, not final approval, to leverage an environmental tax, which will go to the waste pickers, helping to finance childcare, better working conditions, and interestingly, making a contribution to the social monotax. So we heard from Shahra about the monotax, so increasing social protection. So those are some of the interesting examples that we have. And I think one point to make is that these kind of examples don't take the place of a social protection floor. They're in addition to, right, when we're talking about increasing adequacy. And it's also not to promote fragmentation by sectors. I mean, I think that's a big problem in India. But there are possibilities to think of a single fund, to think of a single social security fund, into which there are multiple revenue streams. So we saw a pilot in Zambia, the National Pension Scheme, a few years back, where 3 sectors of workers were included under different conditions and with different financing streams: domestic workers, urban informal sector, rural agriculture, all slightly different benefits, all slightly different financing streams. And I think, this perhaps suggests the way forward towards a universal and integrated systems, but with more adequate financing.
Excellent, Laura. Very interesting set of examples and emerging realities in the ever-extending ecosystem around social protection. So great, thank you for sharing. Next, I want to turn to my colleague Arghya, which I think many of you met during the Adaptive Social Protection session. He's the principal climate change specialist here at ADB, responsible for climate change adaptation. But I must say that he's maybe the biggest advocate for adaptive and shock-responsive social protection systems in our institution. He is the brains behind the Community Resilience Partnership Program, which we told everybody about during this week, and it's a really important new source of funding to be able to support innovation in these areas. So we've talked a lot this week, Arghya, about how social protection needs to be an integral component of climate adaptation strategies and climate action. And we've also highlighted new sources of funding, like the one I just mentioned, but there are also others being developed by other institutions as well. So looking at the future, what do you see are some of the opportunities for leveraging new forms of climate finance to support social protection, both at the regional and global level? And is there any guidance that you can give to participants sitting in the room on how to access them?
Sure, thanks, Wendy, and good morning, everybody. And it's great to see the climate community participates in meetings and conferences that are only with climate colleagues. It's great to be in a conference that's not with the climate colleagues and perhaps speak a different language, but hopefully that language resonates with all of you somewhere. I think the financing, so yes, it is true that globally there is an increased recognition that social protection systems can be a very powerful instrument for achieving climate outcomes, both mitigation and adaptation. Now, the question is, we of course need resources to make that happen, and we heard from Laura's presentation, overall social protection resources are limited, fiscal space is limited. But there are 3 kind of global trends in the way climate finance is emerging, which actually can be supportive for taking the social protection agenda forward. Number 1, of course, there is a lot of discussion about increasing the quantity of climate finance, whether it's through contribution from developed countries or even more financing from multilateral development banks like ADB. So we have an increased commitment 400 billion of climate finance between 2019 and 2030, and a certain percentage of that goes towards adaptation. So that is good, that there is increased commitment that we have to increase the finance quantity. But if you go further deep and see, majority of that finance is actually not going into social sectors, let alone social protection per se. It's still very much infrastructure driven, some cases livelihoods, agriculture also. So it is a good basis for us that fine, in the past, not enough climate finance has been spent on social protection, social sectors more broadly, and considering the poor and vulnerable population the most impacted by climate actions, but also climate risks, then there's a case for us to do more there. The second is the quality of climate finance. That's equally critical. A lot of global discussions around. It's not about the volume only, the quality. How is the money passing through? Who is it going to? Is people really benefiting? And I think over here again, social protection provides a great advantage. One is, the argument is a quality of climate finance is more effective when it's channeled through in-country systems. So in countries where you have national social protection systems in place, if those form the delivery vehicle for channeling climate finance to the ones who need the most, so of course, there's a very sustainable way of ensuring finance is delivering for what it's meant for. And the third trend, which I think is very positive, is a huge discussion about what is climate finance and what is not climate finance, right? That's the whole discussion about additionality is only climate finance. And MDBs who are quite active in this space, last year we did a review of our internal methodology, and we have revised the methodology, and we have now a specific typology of projects where we have argued that for some projects, you cannot anymore differentiate development and climate. They are so closely integrated that a project that's well designed in this context, social protection project, with a climate concern from very beginning, should qualify for climate finance. So that's something the MDBs have adopted it in our methodology, so hopefully I'll see more of ADB projects counting as climate finance. But that's the trend. Before I end, so we need money, but we need money, as you were rightly saying, more strategically to see how that money can be allocated. So for me, there are two reasons you need the money for. One is you need resources to strengthen your systems, the enabling environment that social protection systems will provide to deliver in the context of climate shocks and stresses and for just transition also. So over there, of course, the sources of financing, I would say one is national government. They spend a lot on climate change, but very minimal on social sectors and climate change. The second source is the global climate funds, like green climate funds, which have now started recognizing that social protection is an important area of financing. So if you have patience to work for 2-3 years, you can develop a proposal with them. And the third is, I think, MDBs. So we have concessional financing, in our case, Asian Development Fund, in World Bank's case is IDA. And these concessional financing are now creating windows for supporting climate work, specifically for SIDS countries, LDC countries, and we can have more projects going for social protection and climate change. So that's the enabling environment bit. And in terms of actually getting the money to deliver during when a shock happens, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, last year at COP, there were discussions about launching a new global loss and damage fund, which has recognized social protection as an important area of support. We have to be also creative in many countries, private sector for corporate social responsibilities. There are particular policies in place, certain percentages have to go for CSRs, and we can start pooling in CSR resources for going towards climate and deliver true social protection systems. And some countries are entering into carbon markets, where again the proceeds can go towards actually social protection, which will deliver results on the ground. So I think there are many opportunities, but I like your idea of having a one common fund, and then you have different revenue streams to populate the fund, and different revenue streams will cater to different kind of needs. but they will be governed by a common framework or umbrella. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Argo. Very interesting set of observations on the trends, and much to look forward to going forward, especially with the upcoming discussions in COP28 as well. Hope that that becomes even more clear. And now I'd like to turn to my colleague Arup Chatterjee. Arup is a principal financial sector specialist here at ADB, working on reforming and developing capital markets, contractual savings, and insurance sectors. His work has also focused on innovative insurance solutions for improving the financial protection of vulnerable and underserved populations prone to various idiosyncratic and covariate shocks. So, Arup. The pandemic was very quick to highlight the gaps in social protection systems and the large missing middle population, particularly in Asia and Pacific. It also highlighted that existing social protection instruments and measures are not fully equipped to address the needs of this large and diverse population. So your work at ADB has focused a lot on localized fit-for-purpose instruments, particularly new forms of insurance that are emerging in the region. And while some of these initiatives are small and limited in scope and coverage, they are also important examples of complementing approaches and tools to help manage risks for specific populations. So can you briefly describe some of the examples that you see emerging in the region and their role in addressing gaps in the social protection umbrella going forward?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Wendy, and good morning, everyone. I will take a cue from where Argo left, in a sense. We definitely need comprehensive and well-functioning social protection systems to be put in place, but finance is the key. And from a finance sector's perspective, the role of insurance and the private sector becomes important. When I heard Shahra in the morning today, there are definitely huge gaps in social protection provision. And the vulnerable groups, of course, have access to some of the conventional social protection schemes, like cash transfers. But the missing middle, which is the informal workers, the self-employed, and that is what we have heard, in fact, in today's morning's panel also, have limited or no access to social protection. So, and then when you look at the climate risks, I am reminded of the story of Ernest Hemingway, where he mentions The Sun Also Rises, where a man is asked how he went bankrupt. And he says gradually and then suddenly. So we have to also look at the transitory risks of climate change which is happening. We heard about climate shocks, but then there are those slow onset disasters where people are losing sources of income over a period of time. So suddenly they will have no income. They are losing income over a period of time. So there will be these multi-hazard compounding effects also we need to look at, where people will lose not only income because of climate change, but there could be pandemics, there could be other eventualities in life, like death of a breadwinner and things like that. So, and social protection systems are inadequate in many ways. If you see in terms of design, traditionally or classically, social protection systems have been designed to manage idiosyncratic risks. That is, risks when, say, an individual is affected or households are affected. They are not typically designed to handle covariate risks when large swaths of the population, entire communities are affected. And that is one of the lessons from COVID also, in terms of how we manage these covariate risks. Countries were able to approach international financial institutions, repurpose their budgets in terms of expanding their social protection reach to their population. But then once COVID is over, there is a retreat. And we need to look at new ways of funding such eventualities should it occur again. Not only a pandemic, but also large-scale catastrophes also. And not to forget, Michael mentioned about role of digital. We also need to look at what type of cyber risk can also affect populations. And it's not, incomes will be affected, income streams will be affected, because supply chains will be affected. So it is in that context we need to look at the role of the private sector. And in this sense, the role of insurance becomes important because not only insurance helps in diversifying risk across geography, across portfolios, and across time, but it also helps in better decision making. Insurers have been traditionally in the business of managing risk. So they have better handle on the risk, and using their insights, one can basically design more purposeful strategies. And social protection and insurance have some sort of a symbiotic relationship. There are some of those experts who work on data, like the actuaries and risk modelers, who have a fair idea about how social insurance, social protection, pension benefits should work. So that becomes important. So role of insurance, it becomes important because of the data, because of the diversification of risk, and also it provides more transparency because insurers can also ensure that today we call of digital trail, no longer audit trail, to ensure that the claims reach to the ultimate beneficiary. There is a proof of payment or the proof of claim being received. Now, so looking at this, we have been working in this space, and our area of work has been mainly in the area of agriculture or crop insurance, where we have worked in terms of working with small marginal farmers, providing parametric insurance, more in terms of loss of yield. Traditionally, farmers, when they take loan from the banks, they get some sort of a collateral by buying credit life insurance only to the extent of the loan they take from the bank or from a microfinance institution. But the time and effort they put subsequently after they sow the seed until the harvest, which is called the loss of yield or the loss of income, is generally not protected under conventional schemes. So when you have crop insurance schemes where the loss of yield is protected, loss of income is protected, then farmers are better protected for future loss. Farmers are not only protected for future loss of income, but they are also more proactive in terms of adopting new crop husbandry and animal husbandry practices. So if you want to modernize agriculture, bring in drought-resistant seeds, you want to increase productivity, you want to increase incomes, you want to connect them to supply chains, insurance for crops become important. But of course, there are challenges in terms of using an ecosystem in terms of risk information facilities to be put in place. So that is one thing which is something where we need to look more closely in terms of how can we work with the private sector to enhance protection against weather risks for farmers. An example from India again is where, again due to weather, extreme heat, now we have insurance for women workers where, say, the temperature is between 133 to 135 degrees Celsius for 3 consecutive days. I'm talking in aggregate, not in one day. Insurance company compensate the women workers for loss of income, loss of wages. So that will help them prepare themselves against sickness or not working during those heat stress periods. Similar schemes are there for livestock, where milk yield comes down during the summer months, and the livestock producers are compensated for loss of yield. I'll give you one final example before I conclude. We are also doing a feasibility study for a pilot in Nepal, where we are looking at managing risk at the municipal level, where the municipalities are being sensitized to buy protection on behalf of their residents. So if it is, we have covered a mix of rural and urban towns, and so the risks which would be covered are SMEs and the farmers. The farmers would be covered for loss of crop yields, for floods, precipitation, and drought. Even in a country like the Philippines, which is surrounded by water, farmers have acute losses due to drought. So drought becomes very, very important. So we will be using remote sensing technology, insurance, and also access to finance through banks and microfinance institutions to offer these products to the farmers. Part of the premium would be subsidized by the government of Nepal at the federal level, but the majority of the premium would be subsidized by the municipal governments. And of course, there will be a differentiated approach where farmers can afford to bear the premium. They will also pay. Same goes for SMEs. Many of the SMEs work from their homes, so therefore homeowners insurance against earthquakes and floods, and SMEs loss of income for damage to their assets would also be covered. The local insurance companies there will be designing a product for them, and this will not only help the municipalities in building resilience for their communities, but also in better management of risk, because insurers would be differentiating the price of the premium in terms of the risk. So higher the risk, higher the premium, lower the risk, lower the premium. So the municipalities can invest in risk reduction based on the premiums being charged by the insurers in the market. Thank you.
Thank you, Arup. Very interesting illustrations of the evolving ecosystem around insurance and its relationship. So, Shahra, you mentioned the Global Accelerator as one of the key initiatives by ILO and other partner agencies. And it sets out a set of very ambitious targets to help countries create 400 million decent jobs, including in the green, digital, and care economies, and to extend social protection coverage to the 4 billion people currently excluded. Asia and Pacific has a big potential to make a significant contribution to those targets. So are there a set of key priorities that you're thinking about in terms of gaps and opportunities you see at the fore in this region, which will quickly move the needle towards these targets?
Yeah, thank you very much, Wendy, for that question, which allows me to say a little bit more about the initiative, the Global Accelerator, and maybe to spell out that this is very much a UN initiative. It's not just ILO, it is UNDP, UNICEF, UN Women, World Food Programme, FAO, who are the kind of, together with ILO, really in the coordination of this initiative. So it is a kind of child of UN reform, if I can say, very much this one UN idea. Now, in terms of, I think the Global Accelerator has had quite a lot of traction in Asia, and we've had discussions already with a number of countries that have shown interest in becoming a pathfinder under this initiative. I just made a list of countries like Cambodia, Indonesia, India, Nepal, Philippines, Vietnam, Uzbekistan that have had interest and conversations ongoing. And of these, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Nepal are the ones that are now kind of have committed at a very high political level their interest to becoming a pathfinder. And also, one of the conditions, if you like, of becoming a pathfinder is for the government to really set up a kind of all-of-government, cross-ministry kind of arrangement, a setup for working together, so that, for the ILO, it's obviously Ministry of Labor very often, which is our counterpart. But this initiative really requires much more cross-ministerial work. As well as what we call an across-society approach, involving in particular also trade unions, employers' organizations, civil society organizations. And the three countries that are currently developing their roadmaps with this condition that they have these cross-ministerial coordination mechanisms are Cambodia, Indonesia, and Nepal. So that's kind of happening. And in terms of the potential, I think the potential to accelerate social protection coverage, as we saw, in the broad figures that I showed, I mean, the coverage gaps are pretty significant in the region. And I think by overcoming that financing gap, which would come through the kind of fiscal policies that, we've been talking about, and I think Laura added some very interesting ideas about how that financing can be, and maybe tapping into some of that climate financing. I think that would obviously be also a very important stream. I think there is that potential here, particularly for extension to the informal economy, which we know is very diverse, very heterogeneous, but kind of, from the 2 billion informal economy workers, we know that 1.3 billion are in this region. So the impact is massive, particularly with some of these bigger economies. And in terms of having those integrated policies, I think the potential is really there to do that with employment, with social protection, and really bringing in this just transition. I think there, for example, in some of the countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, we have these JETP initiatives that are trying to have this just energy transitions. And I think with the accelerator, we can really make sure that those transitions are just. And those investments in clean energy are really also at the same time investing in things like unemployment protection, cash transfers, reskilling to, as we said, make sure that people are taken along in these important transitions. So I do think that the potential is huge. I think the interest is there in the region. And I really think that, if I can say, I think in this region, ADB can be a very important partner. And I think part of this idea of working, the UN working together with multilateral development banks and IFIs is really to break those silos that exist. And I'm hoping that, we can find possibilities of aligning the kind of investments that you do in the region with the objectives, of the accelerator as well. So that's kind of, I think, I hope, a call for collaboration, greater collaboration in this area. And one more point, if I can just say, since we're talking about financing for social protection, and I wanted to raise it in my presentation, but I think maybe this would be a good moment to highlight it, is that there has also been on the part of at least the constituents of the ILO at the last recurrent discussion we had on social protection, a big call, particularly coming from ITUC, but also a number of governments, and this was something that was included in the conclusions of that discussion, a call for a global fund for social protection. Now, many of you have heard about this, and I think it's important to keep that idea alive as we talk about particularly possibilities of, climate financing, other forms of discussion around global taxes. And as we saw, the burden on particularly low-income countries in closing that fiscal, gap that we have, including low-income countries in this region, is huge. And there needs to be some kind of complementary, I think, regular global financing. It's not a one-off thing. Social protection is something which needs a regular flow of resources. And so thinking about global financing, climate financing, and others, and keeping that idea of a global fund, I think, alive is important. We do think it has a place in the Global Accelerator, in the financing pillar, but I think we need more discussion on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and thank you for giving that bigger, deeper vision of what the Global Accelerator, all the range of work that's possible underneath that, and the linkages, and especially this point on collaboration. I'm going to come back to that for your second question. We don't have much time left, so I'm going to race, okay? These are fast response questions. But Laura, there's something here that we haven't talked about really very much, and I think it's really important. We've been discussing the significance of inclusion as a key objective for effective social protection systems over the last couple of days. But what does inclusiveness mean in the context of the informal sector? And what does inclusive social dialogue look like, or need to look like, going forward? What do you see as the key challenges and drivers for change? And I'm thinking about this particularly also in the context of all these discussions that we're having about just transition.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Yeah, I think just to start off with the inclusive social dialogue, I mean, I think, you know, we've had experiences working with organizations of self-employed informal workers and arriving at consultation meetings around social protection reforms and finding that there's not a single organization of self-employed informal workers in the room to talk about their needs or interests. And that's not an uncommon experience, right? So it is a challenge. You know, and it's something important because it goes beyond, you know, a sort of brief needs analysis at the beginning. This is about how we build ownership over our social protection systems, right? It's about how people become invested in these systems in the same way as, for example, people are invested in Thailand's universal healthcare system, you know, because that gives it longevity and sustainability. It's hard for organizations of informal workers to get a seat at the table, and that's really what we're talking about, right? It's about people getting a seat at the table, making their voice heard effectively, and having that voice then integrated into the design of policies and programs in a way that responds to the needs that have been expressed. There are two main challenges. The sort of tripartite dialogue spaces, which have legal weight and institutional power, exclude the self-employed. Often that's by law. Self-employed can't organize into unions, cannot be part of the tripartite space. A lot of confusion about whether they should be part of the employers group or the workers group in any case. So what happens is, I mean, there are two main ways that organizations have dealt with this. The first is by allying with formal trade unions or formal employers organizations. So ITUC, for example, is one main pathway that organizations have used. We see this more strongly in Africa than in this part of the world, for sure, but it does happen. The pro of that is that, you know, workers are able to get to where the power lies, to where power sits. But the problem with that is that quite often the needs of the self-employed are not effectively represented by organizations that have been built around waged workers. Sometimes the needs just aren't the same, and particularly for women workers, it can be very difficult to have their voices heard and their particular concerns heard. The other sort of way forward that we see are these alliances outside of the tripartite spaces that are built around social protection. So in Cambodia, for example, I'm thinking of Social Protection for All, which HomeNet Cambodia, one of our affiliates, has just joined onto. It includes trade unions, it includes civil society organizations of all types. They come together, and this is, you know, trying to be a sort of space for inclusive dialogue with the state around social protection. The problem with that is it's not institutionalized. It's not necessarily where power lies. And so I think part of this, you know, part of the push for the future, we don't necessarily want to undermine workers' power in the tripartite spaces either, right? That's an important sort of win that workers have built over the years. But we do want to have spaces for inclusivity. And so I think part of the challenge is to also make sure that these inclusive platforms contain legal weight and are able to have powerful conversations with the state. One issue I did want to flag very quickly before I move on is, I mean, digitization of the state has been quite a discussion through these days. And yesterday we heard about bureaucrat bot in Estonia, I think. And while I like the idea very much, having to go home and apply for a new driver's license, I definitely like the idea of that. But, you know, my time spent working with grassroots organizations in Asia, very often their first experience of social dialogue is with the workers at the front line of the state, right? That is where they start building their organizing power. That is where they start building their power to negotiate. And, you know, we talk about the problem is informal workers aren't organized. Very often where the organization starts is at this front line of the state. And so my concern is, and it just occurred to me as I was thinking about it, if the counterpart in the state is a robot, where and how are we going to be having those human actions that allow us to start building the dialogue and start building the experience that workers need to be able to negotiate?
Good, thank you very much. I know that this is moving from topic to topic, but I'm really trying to get sort of the drum beats of the future out there, and that was a good illustration of what might be around the corner that we need to get prepared for. Argo, when it comes to the development of adaptive and shock responsive systems, data, monitoring, evidence and data for monitoring and decision making is very critical. And we've seen a number of different initiatives across the region. But I'm wondering what you are seeing and thinking about going forward is missing from the equation, what will make better, more anticipatory, and better responsive and more better responsiveness and preparation for climate shocks when it comes to data, evidence, monitoring.
Sure, thanks, Wendy. So I think, yeah, you're correct. A lot is happening in the region and globally also. But I think there are three fundamental changes needed if we really want to make an impact. One is this discussion on the transformative role that social protection could play in an era of changing climate has to be taken to the highest decision-making level. So it's not just that in a world of 1.5 degrees heating and warming, you will have more of the kind of floods we saw last time in Pakistan. And every time it will happen, the social protection system will be called upon to perform, right? So that's one thing. Secondly, social protection programs might themselves suffer. So if you have an active labor market program where you pay wages for workers to work for 8 hours a day to construct a public infrastructure, because of extreme heat, they may not be able to work for 8 hours a day. So there will be impact on social protection programs itself. So I think that's the first point, to really, for decision makers to understand that in a changing climate world, social protection has to play a transformative role. That's number one. Number two change required is partnerships, but partnerships that are continuous and regular. I think that's very, very critical. So for example, if you want to improve social protection data sets from a climate angle, the first thing we need to do is a partnership with the National Hydrometeorological Agency, which provides the data sets, with the National Social Welfare Ministry, which might maintain the data set. And that partnership should happen, not a one-off partnership, it's a regular partnership. So in the agriculture space, for example, many countries in the region, before a monsoon season, they organize what they call a monsoon forum, where they bring the national Met offices and all agencies involved in agriculture to discuss what the forecast is in the next 2-3 months, and accordingly what agency have to take what actions. But in that discussion, social protection ministries are not involved currently. So we have to bring them on board, because if you know in 2 years, 2 months from now, you will face a drought, then social protection systems might be activated. So you have to bring that. I think that relationship building has to be a continuous relationship building, and we have to invest in that. And for me, the third is this convergence of data information systems itself, right? There's a robust data sets on the social protection side, which is very important from a climate point of view to understand vulnerabilities better. On the climate side, we have information around the climate science of it, which is also very critical. So we have to bring these data sets together. The good practices, we heard the other day from Philippines about the bill on anticipatory action, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So if you have a bill in the country which is actually looking at what can the government do before an event happens and how you can trigger financing, that's critical. We do have examples of farmers' schools and monsoon forums I talked about. And third, for example, we know in Indonesia's case, there's a robust data set goes till the village level to map climate vulnerability. If that data set can be superimposed with social protection databases, then I think you have a great win-win. So for me, these are the changes required. And as you said, this is the exact reason why ADB had established CRPP, the Community Resilience Partnership Program, to really help governments improve the enabling environment in social protection to deliver in a climate changed world. So I hope forward countries will access the resources available, and we look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Argo. And then Arup, just very quick response. Meeting the ambition of universal social protection coverage in the future will need out-of-the-box thinking to leverage traditional instruments and community-driven risk management mechanisms for hard-to-reach populations. Could you give us a few examples of such mechanisms you see emerging in the region and how they could link to traditional systems?
Well, thank you. I think when we talk of risk, we talk of different segments. The individual is at the front line of the risk. So when somebody holds the umbrella over their head when it's raining, it's risk management. When the lady at home puts aside a handful of rice for rainy days, that's also risk management. That's risk management at the family level. Then we have seen in COVID the role of the community, where they have also played a major role in risk management, not only in terms of providing financing, but also other types of support. Of course, digital played a role, but the community played a much larger role, sometimes more than the government. So the role of the community is very, very important. And communities should be encouraged to set up their own funds. In many countries, they already have such funds. And these funds are generally used for managing small exigencies like sickness in the community, or to meet certain eventualities like damages to a canal or something like that. So those things should be formalized, and basically those funds are perfect for managing idiosyncratic risks. That means very, very localized risks. But again, catastrophic risks are something which those funds cannot manage. So there they should be having a benefit of risk transfer. So the risk sharing element should be there. There has to be a risk transfer element where they can work with insurance companies to transfer the risk, and also work with governments to see that the corpus of those funds can expand and increase so that a wider community can get additional benefits and additional coverage. So the role of the community is very, very important. When we talk of insurance, there is lack of trust. I've traveled to 97 countries. Wherever I go, I hear insurance companies don't pay claims. That's the first thing I ask the taxi driver, do you have insurance? And do insurance companies pay claims? They say, no, we don't pay, they don't pay claims. So that trust is very important. And the communities are important to ensure that the insurance experience there is a positive experience of insurance. And that trust can be instilled when we use the community and the community members together. There are mutuals, cooperatives, and community-based organizations in many parts of the world which have been very, very successful. They are not for profit, and therefore they can make insurance affordable. And then there is a community rating of risk. So the credit risk of the community also comes down if you see at the aggregate and portfolio level. So if there is a group insurance, because of the portfolio level, portfolio risk coming down, the insurance becomes more affordable. So we need to work with those communities and design more affordable and fit-for-purpose insurance products. Thank you.
Thank you, Arup. And now to come back to you, Shahra. I think the Global Accelerator depends on partnership and collaboration at all levels and among all stakeholders. And this event here is supported by more than 26 development partners who've come together. And we've had a lot of discussion with everybody about what partnerships can be going forward. Is there anything that you see on the horizon in terms of new forms of partnership, new kinds of mechanisms that are emerging that you think are going to be the kind of thing that helps to really push things forward? I saw on your slide the pilot with the IMF, for example, and you trying to develop the evidence base on financing options. But anyway, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for that question. But maybe just, if I can just add one more point in terms of broader kind of reflections. I think I mean, I think I understand the issues around micro-insurance, community insurance, and we're talking here about, crop insurance and so forth. But I think the issue of social insurance when it comes to the life cycle risks that people have really does require that very broad risk pooling. And I'm sure you would agree as an insurance expert and that's why we need to go beyond the families, beyond the villages, and that's why we need those, reducing the fragmentations that often happens, having these common pools in order to have that kind of very important broad risk pooling that we need. So I think that's, one point I just wanted to emphasize in the context of discussions around insurance. And now thinking about, I think, the kind of partnerships, I do think that it's absolutely critical that we engage, with international financial institutions, and I'm glad you raised the issue around, the pilots that we had with IMF. I think IMF has made a commitment in 2019, an interest in having social spending floors. Now, I think that's a really interesting, this was, as you may remember, Christine Lagarde, who talked about these social spending floors. Now, what exactly, how much, how do we determine what the social spending floor is? These are, I think, issues on which there can be quite a lot of collaboration with those of us in the social protection community who are interested in having financing for a social protection floor, and of course for the more, but at least at the minimum, for a social protection floor. So looking at the way in which countries can really kind of expand the fiscal space and create the fiscal space, I think that is critical. Many of the countries that are working with the IMF, they get loans, or whether they're Article 4, missions that go to IMF, these are the same countries that have also made commitments, in other fora, in the ILO or the UN, in terms of many of the international labor standards that are in place, and have expressed an interest and a commitment to building those social protection floors. So I think we need to kind of also at the global level really reduce the kind of silos that we have and the way in which governments in one forum may make certain commitments, about building a social protection floor, and in another forum, through loan conditionalities, be in a situation where they can actually not find the financing and may even have to go through a whole, wave of austerity. We need that greater coherence, and that doesn't come by one institution dictating its terms to the other. It has to come through those collaborations, sometimes very difficult conversations, and sometimes I think those can be very fruitful in really trying to find that common ground. And in the 4 pilots that we had, I think we were very careful not to step on each other's sensitive issues, but really try and find that common ground in terms of how we can create that fiscal space. There was interesting work in Mozambique, in Iraq, not the most, comfortable situations and countries. And I think that work really did show that we can find that common ground and create a kind of more cohesive and coherent policy advice coming from international institutions that is not contradictory and puts governments in a difficult situation of saying, well, you ILO, you tell me one thing, but IMF says something else. And I think we need to kind of make sure that that policy advice is more coherent because of the governments that we're supposed to support and serve. So that's, I think, a call for greater collaboration and coordination.
Great, thank you. So a good place to end, but just 1 minute, Michael. Was there any final reaction from you?
Yes. Something I didn't see a year ago when I wrote the chapter is the emerging role of complexity in and the role of social protection. You started this by saying we want to get down to the nuts and bolts of how to do things. And complexity is almost defined by not knowing how to do the thing you need to do. Tackling poverty and vulnerability is simple. Give cash to the poor. Strengthening developmental outcomes, that's more complicated. We need to integrate. But transforming, as you pointed out, a just transition to green and sustainable development, that's the most complex thing that we're tackling. And getting the local knowledge, building the partnerships, these are key elements of tackling that complexity.
Okay, thank you very much. This was A View from the Future. Who knows what we'll see in 2026? And now I think we'll take our break. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for steering us through the complexities of, and to our panel discussion for getting us through the complexities of social protection. And yes, we will pause now for a 30-minute break. The parallel sessions will begin at about 11:45. So again, please refer to the Events Air app for the schedules and venues of sessions. And then we'll all meet back here in the afternoon at 3:15 for the closing plenary session. Have a good break and parallel sessions, everyone.